This week's Tales from the Territories was the penultimate episode of the season, covering Jim Crockett Promotions and the evil heels of the Carolinas. This is the one that I was looking forward to probably the most. I really enjoyed it. It did not have much in the way of news stories to offer, though, except for the Nikkita Lyons one. No, the Nikkita Koloff one. I won't make that mistake again. The Nikkita Koloff one about the screen test for Rocky IV. I guess he's told the story before, but I had never heard that story before. The round table was Arn Anderson, Ricky Morton, Baby Doll, and David Crockett, with Jim Cornette and Nikkita Koloff interviewed separately. They were not with the others at the round table. They were interviewed individually. Cornette doesn't surprise me since he hasn't left his house since the pandemic started. He just doesn't travel anymore. We got a brief history lesson of Crockett Promotions, or Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling as it was known at the time. Jim Crockett Sr. made Dusty Rhodes the booker, and Crockett became known as a heel territory, very heel-heavy. Arn Anderson called 1985 to 1988 the golden era of wrestling, and said that it will never be topped. He said it will always be the greatest era of wrestling. I don't disagree that nothing will ever top 1980s pro wrestling. I won't limit it to 85 to 88. I'll just say that nothing will ever top 1980s wrestling. You get no disagreement from me on that. I grew up in the Northeast watching the WWF, but I would get glimpses of the NWA when I would be in my grandparents' house since they had cable and we didn't. I thought the Road Warriors looked cool, but I never really got into it until years later. That's when I gained an appreciation for how fucking great Crockett was, right? With the Horsemen and the Road Warriors and the Steiners and Dusty and Luger and Sting, and Vader came later on, but it was great. Cornette was a heat magnet back then. He was a heat-seeking missile. Still is today, and never even has to leave his house. People would throw all kinds of things at him: bottles, rocks, eggs, tennis balls, which actually kind of makes sense if you think about it. He said he was the only civilian at one point to have to wear a bulletproof vest to go to work. One common theme of these Territories episodes is how much people believed back then. And even the ones who knew or kind of knew what wrestling really was, if you were that good at your job, you could rile them up so much that they would want to kill you. Like literally kill you. They would try to attack you, coming through the crowd, leaving the building and the parking lot. Like, these people took it very seriously. There was an angle where Cornette hit Baby Doll in the stomach with his tennis racket, and the announcers told the people that, well, she may never be able to have children as a result. And Cornette cut a promo right after and said, good, nobody wanted a thing like that to reproduce anyway. It's like the things they got away with back then. That was heat. That was real heat. And when Baby Doll eventually got her revenge, the angle they did was they put a noose over Cornette's neck, and they tied him to the back of a pickup truck out back. And they had a signal that when they banged on the truck, I think 2 times, she would hit the gas and take off. Now, Cornette got his thumb under the noose at the very last second, just in case. And in all the excitement, Baby Doll took off a little too early. So because Cornette got his thumb under the noose, he was able to slip out of it quickly. Had he not done so, she would have taken his head clear off his shoulders. And you hear stories like this, or you watch the angle where Eddie Gilbert hit Jerry Lawler with his car, and you appreciate the lengths that they went to make it all seem real. There were no stuntmen involved. You were one wrong move away from tragedy. You know, you had to make it look good. You had to make it look real, because if not, you could lose the people. And if you lost the people, you didn't have guaranteed television money to fall back on if they stopped buying tickets. You didn't have all the merch money they have now. You didn't have $50 million for a Saudi Arabia show. Fans buying tickets, that was how you paid the bills and paid the talent. You know, when I talked about Portland Wrestling and Don Owen a couple of weeks ago, there was no contract with the television station. There was no money being exchanged. The television show was a free advertisement for their live events. That's how you made your money. So there was this need to protect the business. You had to protect kayfabe. Baby Doll was second generation. Her mother and father were both wrestlers. Her father promoted shows in Texas as well. So she got her start in world class as a valet for Gino Hernandez. Michael Hayes is the one who told her, hey, call Dusty. And she called Dusty and he said, hey, when can you start? And she started in the Carolinas. And she was such a good heel. She had a pregnant woman at one point standing on a chair in the crowd, reaching over and grabbing her by the hair, trying to get her one night. And she turned around to go strike her in the stomach, only at the last second she realized that the woman was pregnant. And she was able to stop herself in time before she could really hit her. She almost hit a pregnant lady. And she said she couldn't understand why is this woman, if she's so pregnant, why would she be standing on a chair trying to grab at me? And Arn Anderson is sitting right there next to her at the round table. And he just says, because you were good at your job. They covered the famous angle at the Omni in Atlanta, which Arn said was his favorite all-time wrestling venue. It was dark. Everything was black except the lights over the ring. It's not surprising to me at all that Triple H used that same kind of lighting on a lot of the black and gold NXT takeovers, as someone who grew up watching Flair and the Horsemen and Dusty. This was the night where Dusty saved Ric Flair from a beatdown by the Koloffs after his cage match against Nikita. But then Flair turned on Dusty and joined with Arn and Ole Anderson in the cage and beating Dusty down. They broke his ankle. This was the formation of the Four Horsemen. I mean, Arn wouldn't name it until a promo later on, but this was basically the genesis here of the Four Horsemen and the alliance between Flair and the Andersons. And the first time where when the babyfaces hit the cage to try to get inside and save the day, they couldn't. You know, the fans were used to seeing the heels getting their comeuppance and the babyfaces would come out and save the day. That didn't happen here. And, the heels beat them back. Every time they tried to climb over the cage, they'd knock them down. And actually, now that I say that out loud, very similar to the angle they did after the Bret Hart-Owen Hart cage match at SummerSlam in '94. Maybe that's where they got it from. We had Hart family members scaling the cage, the Bulldogs scaling the cage, all the Hart brothers trying to get inside, and Owen and Owen and Anvil rather inside or knocking him down. Right? It's classic pro wrestling. And so the heels beat them back. There was a riot in the building. Ole had seen things like this happen before. And he told Arn, let's get the hell out of here, because he could see this was going to a bad place. But the fans were right up against the cage. There was no guardrail holding them back. There were about 10 Atlanta police officers who finally showed up. They escorted them out of the cage, but they had to get through the crowd to get to the locker room. So were the officers not there, things would have turned out very badly for these men. Arn said it was the only time in his life, in a wrestling setting, where he thought he was going to die. They were able to get to the back. They were all bleeding. None of it was from anything that happened in the cage. To be a heel in the territory days, you really did have to watch your back. They talked about Starrcade 86, the night of the Skywalkers. The night that Jim Cornette fell from the scaffold 20 feet above the ring and blew out both his knees. There was a scaffold match between the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express. Road Warrior Hawk wrestled that match coming in with a broken leg, which they did not mention here. But he had a broken leg coming into this match. He climbed up on top of that thing and wrestled with a broken leg. I hate scaffold matches. I have never seen a single scaffold match that I liked or that I thought was anything but shit. You can tell the guys up there are scared to death, so everybody is moving in slow motion because they don't want to fall. And unless someone does fall, there's no reason to be excited. It's all based around who's going to fall and kill themselves, basically. Nobody even talks about this match, the match itself. They talk about Cornette falling. That's all they talk about. Arn said the night of the Skywalkers was a battle between the Booker and the boys over who was going to be going up on that scaffold. So he makes it sound like they didn't have the match announced in advance. I'm not sure about that. But Arn said that he would never do it. And they all agreed this is not safe. The original idea that Dusty pitched was that after the match, Cornette would throw his legs up, he would fall backwards like a cheerleader, and the Midnights and Big Bubba Rogers was with them as their bodyguard. They would all be down below to catch him. Cornette gets there, he looks at this thing, he sees how high the scaffold is, and he said, I'm going to kill these guys if I fall that way. We can't do this. So he came up with the idea of just dropping down feet first. He would drop down Well, first of all, he would drop to his stomach on top of the scaffold, and very slowly, kind of, as Road Warrior Animal was like struggling with him, he would kind of position his body to now he's dangling underneath the scaffold. He's hanging, right, by his arms. And then what would happen is, as he would dangle there for a little while, he would swing back and forth. At just the right moment, he would let go. And Big Bubba would catch him. All Bubba had to do, Bubba was a big guy. All Bubba had to do was just stand there, put his arms out, and catch this guy. Well, Bubba did not catch this guy. He was 3 feet off, and Cornette fell straight down and blew out both his knees, including his ACL. This is a famous quote from Big Bubba after it was over. Jimmy, you fell so fast. That's what he told Cornette. He also tore all the ligaments in his knee that keep it attached to the femur and the tibia. Basically, he obliterated the meniscus is what he did. The surgery on his right knee, he said it cost him, and he said this in other interviews, not here on the show, but he said the surgery on his right knee cost him $1,500 because he had insurance, but that was his deductible. I know all about that. But it was just a scope. He never actually had the knee fixed because it would have kept him out of work for at least 6 months. And he couldn't afford to take that much time off. Back then, if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. So he paid for them to just scope it and just cut off all the little nerve endings that were floating around in there because that's what was causing him the pain. So they chopped all those off. So all these years, he's had no ACL in that knee. And he has said in other interviews that that knee actually feels better today than the other knee that he had ACL surgery on years later, which is now his bad knee. So go figure. We got some tales from Nikkita Koloff, and it's still a trip to hear him speak like a normal person now after watching him on TV doing the Russian accent. Even wrestlers in the business thought they had a real Russian working in the Carolinas, but he was born Scott Simpson. He played football in Minnesota. He had a full head of hair. But they brought him in at the height of the Cold War as this Russian badass, and they had him shave his head. And he stayed in full gimmick all the time, right down to not speaking any English when he would be out in public or at a restaurant. He let his uncle Ivan, who he was traveling with, Ivan Koloff would do all the talking for him. He said that he even got a subscription to Pravda magazine so that the mailman would see it and think, wow, this dude really is Russian. I guess in case he was a wrestling fan, he wouldn't suspect anything. He lived the gimmick 24/7, even backstage, to where Cornette said Arn Anderson one day in the back told him, you can drop the accent now. We all know that you're from Minnesota. You don't have to do it around us. He claims he went so far as to have Lithuania listed as the birthplace on his daughter's birth certificate when she was born, and they were in the hospital. One story I did not know is that Nikita screen tested with Sylvester Stallone for the part of Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. He did not get the part, obviously. If he did, who knows where his career could have ended up. Hogan as Thunder Lips in Rocky III was huge for him. The backstory, which they, again, did not get into here, but I'll fill in the gaps. Had to do some homework on this because I'm fascinated by stories like this that I've never heard of before. Terry Funk had become friends with Sylvester Stallone, who was friendly with a lot of wrestlers back then. Like I said, they cast Hogan in Rocky III, so it's not much of a stretch to think that he would have cast another wrestler in Rocky IV. Stallone did a film in 1978 called Paradise Alley. And there are a ton of wrestlers in that movie, including Terry Funk. Ted DiBiase is in there, Dick Murdoch, Ray Stevens. I think Haku is in that movie. Stallone reached out to Terry Funk and said, look, I'm doing a Russian character in this new Rocky movie. Do you know of any Russians? Now, Funk didn't know of Nikita directly, but he had heard about him. And long story short, they ended up sending Nikita the script. He memorized all of his lines front and back. He would be riding in the car up and down the roads with Ivan Koloff memorizing his lines. They flew him out to Hollywood to screen test. He claims it was him. It was down to 3 people. Him, Kerry Von Erich, and Dolph Lundgren. They were the final 3. I have no idea why they thought Kerry Von Erich would be good for the part of the evil Russian. He gets there, and Kerry asks him, are there lines that we're supposed to know for this? Nikita knew then and there, my chances just went up by like 50% here. He said, no way Kerry was getting the part. He didn't even know his lines. He goes, Kerry, what are you talking about? And then they send you a script. He goes, oh, I don't know. Based on the stories of how he was back then, I would be surprised if Kerry Von Erich knew his own name. He said that at the end of the audition, Stallone told him, okay, I want you to turn to me at the very end so we could have like a face-to-face, like we were in a real boxing match. So they yell cut at the end, and Nikita says, how was it? And they told him it was great, except for one thing. At the end, when you turned and you did the face-off, you completely blocked out Stallone. Because Nikita was gigantic back then. He was a monster. Stallone was probably 160, 170 pounds. Legit. He was only 5'6". Nikita had to be every bit of 280 or 290 back then. I mean, you talk about swole. You go look at Nikkita Koloff. As soon as they said that, he said he knew it was over. Even though they didn't call him back for a few weeks to give him the bad news, they said, we'll get back to you. He knew. He knew right then and there. He said, that's not going to be good for Stallone's ego, and that's probably not going to be good for my chances here. And they told him, they said, look, you nailed your lines, but the size difference between you two is just too unbelievable even for Hollywood. And keep in mind, in that movie, Rocky would have been in his mid-30s. So he's 35 years old. With that much of a size difference, it just wasn't realistic to see him standing there in the ring with this guy. Lundgren was taller than Nikita, but he was probably 60 or 70 pounds lighter than Nikita was. And he was not as wide either. I mean, again, Nikita was like a fucking brick house, this guy. So he ended up getting, Lundgren ended up getting the part instead. And what an iconic part it was. But they told him that's the only reason you didn't get the role. They covered the famous plane crash in 1975, where Ric Flair broke his back, the plane crash that nearly changed the course of wrestling history. It was Ric Flair, David Crockett, Bob Bruggers, who was fairly new to the business, Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, and Johnny Valentine. They were on a flight from Charlotte to a show in Wilmington, North Carolina. Jim Crockett sent his brother David on the flight to replace him at the very last minute. The pilot is this 28-year-old Vietnam veteran who made the decision to dump some fuel to allow them to take off because he had a plane full of pro wrestlers. It was too heavy. He had to dump some of the fuel. But he didn't distribute their weights evenly. So they didn't get into the details here, but what happened is Valentine noticed mid-flight that they were out of gas. And the pilot told them, oh, don't worry, because my wing tanks are full. So it's all good. Then they started going down. It's all good until you start going down. Then you know something's wrong. The plane starts to, descend, and the pilot just freaks out. And Johnny Valentine slaps him to try to get him to come to his senses and calm down. And he told people after the crash, he goes, had the pilot not panicked, they probably could have landed safely. Instead, they crashed 100 yards short of the runway. They narrowly missed slamming into a water tower. The pilot ended up in a coma. He died 2 months later. Bruggers never wrestled again. Valentine never wrestled again. They both broke their backs. Valentine ended up paralyzed. Flair broke his back in 3 places, but he was able to get back in the ring 4 months later. Flair was originally supposed to be sitting next to the pilot, not Johnny Valentine. Flair was up front. Valentine said that Flair was scared to be up there. He was whining about it. So he told Flair, get in the back, I'll sit up front. Imagine if Flair had stayed in the front seat. Jim Cornette said that it was Tim Woods who saved pro wrestling in the Carolinas and not only saved pro wrestling in the Carolinas, but effectively saved what would later become WCW. He was the lone babyface on the flight. Everybody else was a heel. If it had come out that he was traveling with the heels, it would have killed the territory. Remember, kayfabe. And Valentine was his mortal enemy, no less. So Woods was hurt in the crash. He had some broken ribs. He had some other minor injuries. His injuries were not as severe as the others. When police asked for their names, he gave his real name of George Wooden and claimed that he was a promoter, not a wrestler. In the hospital, he checked himself out early against doctor's orders. Some people were starting to put it together that, George Wooden, is that Tim Woods? Was Tim Woods on the flight? So he showed up to wrestle 3 days later as Mr. Wrestling, like nothing had ever happened, even though he could barely move. Again, he had broken ribs. He could barely move. He did it to throw people off the scent and prove that he wasn't on the flight. How could he be on the flight? He's back in the ring wrestling. How could he have been in a plane crash? Today, he couldn't get away with that. People would be on TMZ with a list of every person on that flight within 5 minutes of it hitting the ground. He probably cost himself money in the insurance settlement. You know, all the other wrestlers got money out of their settlements. Woods supposedly got little to nothing because he checked himself out of the hospital so early. All in the name of maintaining kayfabe. And like Cornette said, it probably saved the promotion, which would go on to become the only company that ever kicked Vince McMahon's ass. One last story that Ricky Morton shared, which Dutch Mantell goes into detail on in his book. I think it was in his book. He and Ricky have been friends for many years. And the story has to do with Ricky blaming Tully Blanchard for his marriage falling apart. Ricky was married with 3 kids at the time. And his wife had suspected in the past that, he may have been sleeping around on her on the road, which of course he was. One half of the Rock and Roll Express getting, all the attention from the ladies the way they were on the road in the 80s when wrestling was one giant party. I would be shocked if they weren't cheating on their wives. But every time she confronted him about it, Ricky would deny it and swore, "I would never do that to you. I would never go behind your back and cheat on you." And she could never prove it, right? There were only suspicions that she had. She had been wanting him to accept God and Jesus and be born again, like Tully Blanchard did after years of living like a wild man. And she knew Ricky was friends with Tully, and she was hoping that he would follow in his path, I guess, but Ricky resisted. He didn't want to have any part of that. So then it just so happened one night that Tully was going to be live as a guest on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson. He was going to go on there. He was going to tell his story about how he became a child of God. I guess Ricky's wife was a regular viewer of the show, and when she saw that Tully was going to be on, she wanted Ricky to watch the show with her, figuring maybe this is the night that he would finally see the light, I guess. And he's like, "Sure, yeah, I'll watch it with you." Well, all was going well until Tully started talking about women and all the loose women that the wrestlers would party with. And Ricky knew, oh boy, this is not good. He was fine with the stories he was telling about the booze and the pills and the drugs, but this was a bridge too far. And he could see his wife's demeanor changing the more that Tully spoke. Here, he thought all was well with him and his wife, finally, right? And now Tully is just fucking it all up by running his big fat mouth. And then it happened. He didn't just talk about the women, he named names. And the name that he named was Ricky Morton. He talked about naked women running around his hotel room and running back and forth between his room and Ricky Morton's room, doing drugs and drinking and having sex all night long. So in the span of 30 seconds, Ricky's life went from the penthouse to the outhouse, and he knew that his marriage was over. He got busted. He got busted on live television, no less. I've searched for the video of Tully on the 700 Club. I can never find it. I've seen Sting on there, Lex Luger, Shawn Michaels. I can't find the Tully one. I would love to see that. So again, there were some fun stories and some stories about major events in history here that have been documented before. But I thought it was a fun episode. This Tuesday is the season finale covering Mid-South Wrestling. They've got an all-star panel with Jim Ross, Jake the Snake Roberts, Ted DiBiase, and Michael Hayes. I'm surprised they didn't get Jim Duggan for it, because he was a big part of Mid-South as well. And actually, his feud with DiBiase is legendary. And then the week after that, so that's the season finale for Tales from the Territories. The week after that, the 9 Lives of Vince McMahon documentary that was supposed to air on Vice in October, it's finally going to run. So that's going to be December 13th at 9 p.m. Eastern.